Hello, Neil here from Diagonal Move. Welcome back to the gaming table, and today we have the entirety of World War II Eastern Front Operation Barbarossa on my coffee table, which frankly is kind of awesome. We are here looking at a game called DAMOS, or a series called DAMOS, which stands for Destroy All Monsters Operational Series, published by CSL Publications and comprising Army Group Centre, Army Group North and Army Group South. It is the whole of Operation Barbarossa, running from June through to about December, I believe, and you are going to be playing as either the German forces or the Russian forces during those famous months of 1941, in which the tide started to turn, shall we say, for World War II. The position here at the moment is at the end of turn one, so the Germans in blue have pushed their way across the Polish-Russian border, here and here, and also here, and the Soviets have been taking a pounding, as you might expect. Before we go into what's happened in the turn, let's have a think about what DAMOS is. It is a system that allows campaigns to be played in small chunks or as a big campaign. And so the three games, Army Group Centre, North and South, have been combined in what's in front of you on the screen into one game. This is the grand campaign game of the system, if you like. Broadly speaking, Army Group North is this line here, with the centre being broadly there, and then south being this part here. The map is orientated to one side, so the eastern side of Russia is here with Moscow there. Leningrad, which would be north, is here, and then Kiev and Kharkov down here and here, with the Eastern European countries, Poland, Slovakia, Romania and so on, down the bottom here. So I've reorientated the map to one side to fit it on my table. The game has an interesting setup in which, were you to play them separately, the three games, the different army groups have to respect each other's boundaries. So, for example, the North can't go beyond that line. They cannot go sort of south of that line. The centre have to stay north of this kind of swampy bit until they get past it, and then they can spread out a little more. Whereas the south, which is here, cannot go up above the marshes, basically. So there's quite a restriction on movement if you play them individually. However, when you play them all together like this, there is less restriction on that, and you can cross those operational boundaries if you choose to. We do have Finland up the top here, which doesn't come into the game just yet. I have to get my forces as the German player past Riga first. Here we have the Allies, which are along the Slovakian Romanian borders, which do not come into the game until turn 2, so they've not activated yet. I've highlighted some of these units with these cubes. These are not part of the game. This is just my way of showing which forces have been used, because there's mechanics within the game which require forces to be fresh or spent. My way of showing it is to have this cube. Normally you rotate them, but the map is quite small, or at least this print and play version has been quite small, and things are a bit squashed together, so it's easier for me to just use these cubes. But all of these forces along here have activated to here. There's some really interesting mechanics in the game. The combat system is an intriguing one where you have a CRT, but the CRT tells you how many dice you're going to roll. You have exploitation movement and exploitation combat should you win a combat. There are the ability of some forces, mostly armour and mechanised infantry and so on, to react out of turn order against opponents' advances. There is a really interesting system for supply, where the supply for the different sides is different. and it's based on both rail and non-rail hexes. So for the Soviets, you have I think off the top of my head, I think it's five hexes away from a friendly controlled rail hex is in supply. For the Germans, it's only 3. And you also have to make sure that the end of the railway that you're connected to is converted into an appropriate gauge, which basically you roll some dice and you can advance the converted end of the railway forward. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to reflect that in the game, because I personally would forget whether this bit here, for example, has been converted, into a friendly gauge. I'm not sure how I'm going to represent that in the game, but I'll get there, I'm sure. Anyway, it sounds like there's tons of interesting mechanics in the game. There are plenty of little things to think about. Attrition is quite harsh if you're out of supply. Combat is pretty brutal. Up at the top here we have all the forces that have been eliminated from the Soviet side following these initial advances from the Germans, with just the one German side having been demoralised. There's a bunch of reinforcements coming on with the Germans here, and then here is the Soviets. The Soviets can rebuild. There's a replacement point system where you can rebuild your forces as well. So all in all, it looks like it being a really interesting system. If I sound a little bit hesitant, it's because at the moment there's a degree of usability and functionality that I'm struggling with. One of them being, and this may be because of my print and play copy and the fact that sizes of paper and what have you in the UK is slightly smaller than in the US. But the map hexes are very, very small and they don't quite fit the counters. And when you've got the counter density like this, getting in there, even with tweezers, to pick those up and seeing what forces are under there is quite tricky. And that is partly why I've got these cubes. Another reason I'm thinking slightly hesitant about this game is how do I keep track of the rail conversion? Because, as I said, I need to be 3 hexes away from a converted, controlled, friendly rail source. And let's say that's here. But when this counter here moves forward, and I need to convert that, how do I remember across this entire front line which ones of these rail sources are friendly? I'm going to need to have another cube or something, I think, off the top of my head at the moment. Another challenge I'm having is to do with how ambiguous some things are. For example, I believe it says in the November to February turns, you do a certain thing. Supply changes, I believe, off the top of my head, is what it is. But the map doesn't say what turn represents what months. And also, I believe it runs from June to December. I might have to check that again, I'm not sure. But that's what's ringing a bell at the moment. The other things, such as the terrain, isn't marked. You have a terrain table like normal, but there's no terrain key. So, for example, it will say things like wooded swamp, mountains, or the rest of it. I can only assume this is a wooded swamp. What is a regular swamp? I don't know. These green hexes here are probably the woods, and these are probably the mountains. But I don't know for sure. Again, assuming Warsaw is a major city and Lublin there is a regular city and Helm is a town, but there's nothing to specifically say that. And when you... that's quite tricky. And I'm having to make a lot of assumptions based on how I've played other games or how maps generally work in the real world, like dotted lines are trains and these sorts of lines here are road, that I'd rather not have to make when I'm first coming to a system. And there's also these tracking sheets, which is fine. Sounds absolutely fine. You tick off your losses and all the rest of it on these rather than using strength point counters. There are some strength point counters in that you can use should you choose to. So that's fine. You have the option. That's fine. However, I started off using these thinking this would be a good way to keep track. So you don't have to make tons of strength point counters. I need to think to myself, I have to sift through multiple versions of this, one for each part of the front line, one for each side, so 6 sheets in total, and find where in the relevant sheet the relevant 4 units are on that sheet, and then tick them all off. And that just seems to add so much time so far, so much time. Another thing, without wishing this to sound like a completely negative video, I don't even know who's supposed to go first, because the rules, and there's a core rules and 3 sets of exclusive rules, and the rules, in the core rules, it says the exclusive rules will tell you who goes first. The exclusive rules just says something along the lines of the Russian player doesn't get a turn on foot in turn 1. Now, does that mean the Germans go first in turn 2? Or does that mean the Russians would have gone first, but simply skipped their go in turn 1? And that sounds slightly silly, like, obviously it's the Germans, but if it is the Germans, were this a 2-player game, all of these units here have just activated, and to be fair, it's taken me a solid couple of hours to work my way through. I'm a bit slow perhaps, and there have been a fair bit of looking through the rules and whatever, but it's taken me the best part of a couple of hours. Now, if the Russians don't go first in turn 2, the Russian player would have to sit through another activation of all of these units, plus these units which didn't activate in turn 1, plus this row of reinforcements here, before they really do anything. Now, you do have this system of zones of influence, they're called, where you have these reaction attempts and so on, but in the first turn that doesn't count, so it only comes in now. So I'm very mixed how I feel about this game at the moment. On the one hand, it's amazing you've got the whole of the east front on your coffee table. That is superb. I mean, normally I'd have to buy a bigger house so I can get a bigger table in that would fit one of those games. And there are some really interesting mechanics. That idea of supply sounds really interesting. Combat is interesting, where you, rather than having odds, you have basically you work out the strength points and then you roll dice based on what the result is. There's attrition after combat and all sorts of stuff. It's loads of really, really cool sounding stuff. But it just feels like there's a little something missing in terms of its functionality and usability. So anyway, let's not get negative. It has been an interesting game so far. The Germans have stomped across the front line in the northern, central and southern part of the front line so far. Russians have lost tons of units. They do have the possibility of coming back, though, some of those units, and of course as we move through the game those reinforcements are going to start to come on en masse, and the Russians do have replacement points which allow them to rebuild, and they have far greater numbers of replacement points as well. So it's going to get an interesting game. This initial push by the Germans will slowly become a grinding attrition, I'm sure, as they so often do. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. I'll come back for turn 2 and let's see how it goes after turn 2. I've just finished turn 2 and done the replacements, reinforcements and the strategic movement of turn 3, and it's developing into an interesting situation. The German forces have pushed. Army Group North is heading towards Leningrad, just here, Army Group Centre is crossing these wooded areas, what I think are wooded areas, and Army Group South are pushing towards Kiev just there. So it's moving very nicely. The Germans are ploughing through the Russian forces. I'm not sure if you can perhaps see near over the top of the map there, there's a whole bunch of losses for the Russians. However, some of those Russian losses are being turned into reinforcements and replacements for later turns. The really interesting situations developed where the Germans are already outrunning their supply lines, and it's only the start of turn 3. What I've done with the supply lines is I've used these brown cubes just to show where the furthest extent of the converted and controlled German rail supply is. And you need 3 hexes in the summer months or the non-winter months that are not rail. And if you go further than those 3 hexes to a friendly rail line, you're out of supply, which has effects in combat and on the attrition part of the turn. So already you have sort of a situation where Riga, just under there, is out of supply because this is the nearest rail line and it's actually four hexes away. Here, this Panzer Group 4, I think they are, is out of supply. As is this little group of what I think are mobile infantry just there. And this Panzer Group 3 stack there. In the centre, everything's not quite so severe because we have 3 different rail points that the Germans can get supply from. But in the south, we have these 3, maybe even 4, 5 stacks that are now out of supply. And again, the Allied forces of Romania and Hungary are down the bottom here. And they look like they too may start to struggle in the not too distant future with those supply lines. The Russians, of course, have slightly better supply. They can trace 5 hexes to the rail line. What this means is, in order to get to the victory point hexes, which in this campaign game is 3 of Kiev, Leningrad, Moscow or Rostov, we're going to need to move quite fast, but we're only going to move 3 hexes tops for any one of these rail hexes. So you're going to run the supply over and over again, and even in a best case scenario over the course of 13 turns, I think you're probably only going to get to about here with those rail lines, which means Moscow is always going to be a challenge to get to. Yeah, very, very interesting, but we can already see that the major cities, Leningrad, Kiev, are going to be the first target points. You can see them diverging already. It's really cool. For the Russians, they did have their turn. They did a little bit of reacting in turns 2, turn 1 and 2. And that was interesting with the zones of influence, because you can, the mobile infantry and the tanks can extend a zone of influence up to 3 hexes away, and they can react to a moving German force. And they did that a few times. A couple of times didn't work out so well. They got eliminated. Another couple of times, like here, they ended up failing to react. But if I read the rules correctly, you still are what's called spent. This was at the end of turn 1, and since then they've been demoralised. But that just seems to me that reacting from the Russian point of view is quite a risk, because if you fail to react, not only are you probably going to be outnumbered, you also run a risk of losing that turn's activation, because if you activate, you don't get another go until you've reset your forces, which will be at the end of your turn, and you'd be reacting during the German turn. So that's interesting. I don't know if that's meant to be mainly a way of retreating quickly, or whether there's another way of using that later in the game where you can react and cut off supply lines, stuff like that. Maybe that's how it works. But But at the moment, with the discrepancy in stacking limits, it's 4 for the Germans and 2 for the Soviets. It just seems like the Soviets are always going to be outnumbered. And then they have the Soviets also have these kind of mandatory attacks. You roll a d3 and you have a mandatory number of attacks to do in the Army Group North area, which is sort of this bit here. And if you don't, you lose replacement points. And that's really interesting and quite harsh. I think this is going to be quite a harsh game for both sides, both with the attrition and the challenges of trying to resist this German advance. So the game is moving along, it's progressing quite nicely, some interesting things going on, particularly like the challenging puzzle of the supply lines. On the downside, I have found a few more things which just frustrate me a little bit. The first one being, and this is a print and play thing, I'm sure, I'd hope so anyway, but these kind of dark orange units, they're not Russian, they're actually the Hungarians, I believe. The Russians are these paler colour orange. When I look at the forces reinforcement chart, those units are actually green. Now I checked the file and I've checked my printer and everything seems okay in terms of my printer and my file. I just think that maybe the counter sheet in the print and play game is a different colour to what it's supposed to be. So I don't know if that's a mistake in terms of the files for the print and play, but it's quite confusing if it is, and it seems to be particularly a challenge for the Army Group South game, because some of these, this one here, these Russian tank units have a, you might not be able to see that, but they have like a very faint grey outline, and they don't have their zone of influence printed. So I just wonder if there is a issue with the files in the print and play game. I couldn't say if that transfers to the real game, to the retail game, but in the print and play version, there's definitely some issues with the counters and so on. I did make myself to help with some of the hunting through the rule books and the different exclusive rules to find certain tables and stuff. I did make myself a player aid, which has certainly helped speed things up. So that is something I would recommend if you can. Make yourself a player aid. Turn 6. We are looking at the halfway point almost, very nearly the halfway point of the game. It has been predominantly a German focused game so far. The German turns seem to take a lot longer to play through than the Soviets, which you may be able to tell by the sheer volume of German forces on the board at the moment, and there are an awful lot of Soviet casualties up the top there, but these reinforcements are due to come on soon, and the Germans really don't have much in the way of reinforcements now, apart from the few replacement points and so on that they get, and a very small handful just there that would come on this side of the map here. The Army Group North have charged for Leningrad, have reached the edge of Leningrad now, and are midway through the siege of Leningrad. Army Group Centre is making slow but steady progress along the main road and main rail line towards Moscow. Whether they'll make it or not, I don't know. The attrition is starting to bite. And down the Army Group South area here, Kiev is in German hands. However, the advanced forces are now far outrunning their supply. The Russians, for their part, have mostly been having a fighting retreat. They have to make a few attacks here each turn. I believe I mentioned it before. You roll a dice and that gives you the number of attacks you have to make, or you lose reinforcement points, replacement points, as the Soviet team. Yeah, attrition's nasty in this game. The forces here, it's kind of hard to tell because there's this mix of strength point counters and these kind of status pads. I've wound up using kind of both in the end. It's hard to see on the board, but a lot of these German counters now, they may say 9, like for example this one just here is a 9, but it's probably down to about a 4 or a 5 strength. So the attrition's grinding them down, ready for what's like to be a much more even force, a much more even fight between the Soviet forces, who are within that two unit stacking limit versus the bigger stacking limits of the Germans. So yeah, the attrition's grinding away at the Germans, and the Soviets are pulling back and back and back. But they're only going to be able to go so far before they're going to have to start doing something else, because we're not that far away now from Moscow. Kiev's taken, Leningrad only needs to be isolated. Rostov might be tricky to get to. It's all the way down the far corner. So yeah, we're halfway through the game, and I think that's where I'm going to stop the campaign, stop the video, stop the game. I found the game a challenge to play for practical reasons as much as anything else, with the various reasons I mentioned before, to do with some of the ambiguities and the sizing of the hexes and so on. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to summarize the things I really like about the game, and some of the things I wish might be slightly more clear. Won't go into everything because I've said some things already, but what do I really like about the game? This idea of supply is one of them. It's also conversely on the side of the things which I wish would improve, but let's stick for now for the things I like about it. It's a very slow process, and that really reflects the difficulty the German side must have had in converting the railway hexes as their front lines were advancing forward to change the gauge from the railway gauge used in Germany from the gauge that was used in the Soviet Union. That was a piece of information I had no idea about before playing this game. I did not know that that was a challenge that they had during this operation. So that's really interesting, and it's reflected really well, because you may go quite far, next turn not so far, representing the difficulties of converting in different places. So that's really neat. I do like that a lot. Combat is very interesting. I don't think I've covered this so far, but you basically have these little counters, and you have like orders. So you might have a penetration attack, a grand assault, a regular attack, and you also have these kind of defensive orders as well. And you play. If I just pull up this little piece of paper here, you basically the attacker plays one, and the defender plays another, and where they meet, that's the DRM or loss point modifiers and so on that you may have to apply to the combat. So that's really interesting, and you spend movement points to do that, which is really interesting, because sometimes you can, if I just give an example, you may be able to move a few spaces and then do a weaker attack. If you want to do a stronger attack, you've got to be right next to them. And depending on how much you've moved, depends on how powerful the attack can be. And then you have the option as the defender to do different things, one of which being a counter attack, where you can basically attack straight away after the combat, more or less regardless of what the attacker does, which then changes the system from this kind of loss sort of modifiers equaling dice kind of system here, where you work out your strength points and you both sides roll dice, and depending on how strong your force is, depends on what the losses are. You go from that system into this kind of more traditional CRT odds-based system for the counterattack, where the roles are kind of reversed, and normally the defending side would be on the left, but it's the attacker because they're defending now from the counterattack. So it's interesting. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's interesting. The idea of playing the two order tokens to determine what's going to happen is reminiscent of a game I've played called Winter Thunder, and it does a similar idea, and it's a very interesting idea that I do kind of wonder whether more games could implement something like that, because it's a really neat idea having that slight kind of fog of war type stuff going on with orders you play. The other thing about combat, which is different, and I must admit I'm on the fence with this one, is that combat is not performed as I show here, where things are adjacent. They're actually in hex. So the counters have to be in the same hex to do the combat. So that idea of moving, you need to pay your movement points to move into the hex, and that's intriguing. I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be honest, because it's the first time I've come across that idea. I can see its benefits and its disadvantages, but I'm a bit on the fence with it. It's a neat idea that you're attacking in the one location, but then there are certain ambiguities which I'll come on to about it that I'm not 100% sure of. In addition, there is what's called an exploitation move. So you've won, the defender's retreated off, and then you can go again as the attacker if you've won, and you have an exploitation rating depending on the where are we? It's here. You have an exploitation rating depending on the type of unit you are. If you win, you use your exploitation rating between 0 and 2, depending on whether you're infantry, mechanized, whatever, plus the movement points you spent to do the attack, which again is really cool, really interesting idea. And then you can do basically a second attack or a second move or what have you. So that's really neat. The reaction is cool. That I like that too. And again, I've seen this in other games where the non-phasing player, as they call it, gets to take a turn out of sequence. That's really neat. I think playing solo any game with that type of mechanic is less rewarding than it would be two players, because you have to hazard a guess, shall we say, when the other side might want to do a reaction attempt. But it is an interesting way of keeping both sides engaged through what would be something of a German onslaught for the first several hours you play the game. So there is plenty to like about the game. Some of the things that do frustrate me, and it is this case of the game gives with one hand and kind of tries to take it back with the other. This idea of the supply, how you keep track of where the converted hexes are is beyond me. I've got these cubes to give the furthest extent, but then you have, if I just move those out of the way, then you have these sections like between here, where this bit here is converted, this piece is converted, but this bit in the middle is not, and I would have to move one of these counters along those hexes to convert it. How I can do that without having a string of these cubes along, I really don't know, and that just adds to the clutter, having all these cubes everywhere, which I'm not a huge fan of. The other sort of issue is, like for example here, the Russians have taken back a junction where the rail was converted. Now the Russians are on the hex where the railway line crosses. Does that mean that the railway hex needs to be converted back? And do the Germans have to redo that conversion? It's not clear in the rules. It doesn't say, so I assume not. But it's something that I just wonder whether or not you would expect the game, if the game is simulating the Germans redoing the railway, would they not also have to simulate somehow the Russians potentially undoing that to disrupt the supply lines further? I don't know. It doesn't seem to go that far. So that's sort of interesting. With the combat, when you have the in hex combat, if you lose, you retreat a certain number of hexes, between 1 and 3, I think it is. Defending player's choice. If you're the attacker and you retreat, it just says retreat 1. Now, is that 1 from in hex, where the combat is, or 1 from where you started? I don't know, and that's potentially important, because if you are needing to, let's just pretend it's a situation something like this. If you retreat just 1 hex to where you started from, 1 hex from where the combat was to where you started from, that's fine. But if you have to retreat 1 hex from where you entered combat, so you have to go back to here, you would then be potentially in a zone of control and you're eliminated. And I can't see anywhere where it says retreat 1 hex from the combat hex or 1 hex from where you came in. I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm overthinking that. I don't know. But it's little questions like that which I'm finding slightly difficult to work through. And there are a few other things relating to functionality which I've mentioned before, which I'm finding quite difficult. So on the whole, as much as I have enjoyed some parts of this game, I have found other parts quite frustrating. I think this is partly because I've dived into the grand campaign without first trying the individual kind of games, which if I was to take back time, I perhaps would have done. I do think this game has some really good ideas. There's some really neat stuff in here. I just kind of wonder whether it could have been so much more if there had been a bit more functionality, user friendliness added in, a bit more development, shall we say, of the game. Anywho, what I'll do is I will I'll tidy up and upload this player aid I created into Board Game Geek, so people who wish to play the game can have a chance to have a player aid, because there isn't one in the game box as far as I'm aware. And I will finish the video there. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.